Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to react to the rise and fall of the Dutch East India Company. This piqued my interest just based off the thumbnail alone, but also I really would love to learn a little bit more about the Dutch East India Company. We've been doing a lot of stuff recently around Dutch when it comes to the Netherlands and whatnot. And, I also got me one of these little coins recent. You can see kind of the same symbol on this coin as you see on the thumbnail or what you see on the screen right now. This coin right here came from 1786. It's really cool. You can find these coins online with certificates of authenticity, and there's so many coins floating around from the Dutch East India Company. By owning a piece of history, I'd love to learn a little bit about my not just my coin, but the whole thing and what began of this. So regardless of what I know, I'm glad you're here with me. If you like these types of videos, please hit the subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. Also hit that like button, but let's jump into it before we do anything else. Let's jump into it.
Historically adjusted market $7.9 trillion. That was the historically adjusted market capitalization of the Dutch East India Trading Company.
$7.9 trillion adjusted to now. That's like 7 times more than Apple.
It was a for-profit company larger and more powerful than most of history's greatest empires. If it was around today, the larger and more...
Is that the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire we see there? And is it because it's a, what's it called? Mercantile? Not mercantile, yeah, that's right. Is it just because they had a monopoly on, like, the trade? Is that... that's probably it, right? They just had a monopoly on the trade of the East Indies.
More powerful than most of history's greatest empires. If it was around today, the world's first multinational corporation would have been worth more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and still have more than enough money left over to purchase McDonald's, Walmart, and Samsung.
That's a lot.
Most companies would be lucky to last 10 years, but the VOC ruled early global trade for
Oh, so it's VOC. Okay.
Nearly 2 centuries.
Okay. 1799. So this coin, like I said, the coin I have, I don't think you guys can see that, but it says 1786. So 13 years before the demise.
From 1602 until 1799, with an impact that still continues today thanks to its radical business innovations and questionable behavior. But its biggest contribution to the world, if we ignore all the killing, invading, and enslaving, are shareholders. Besides pioneering corporate governance, the creation of shareholders paved the way for modern businesses to become more accessible to the average person. This helped popularize employee welfare like healthcare and pensions, and introduced insurance bonds and joint stock ownership. So, who were the people that owned the most valuable company of all time? How did the concept of a corporation even start? And how did the board of investors influence the direction of world history?
This is very modern conversations for a company or a entity that was 400, 500 years ago.
Chapter 1. Corporate Pirates. The official name was Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie.
That's the VOC. I'm assuming that's all in Old Dutch. It's Germanic. But isn't it Dutch Germanic? Is this basically that?
If any Dutch speakers take issue with my pronunciation, please don't throw your clogs at me. For the sake of convenience, we'll use the simple abbreviation of VOC. The VOC was created by the Dutch government through the States General of the Netherlands. The aim? Compete with European powers in the spice trade. From the 1500s to the 17th century, the Western world expanded with the Age of Discovery. Spice routes were big bucks.
Nairobi. That's in Kenya, I think. It says Kenya. Sri Lanka, Norway, Jakarta, Zoy, Zion, Dushanbe, Moscow, Rotterdam, Holland, Venice.
Empire was big business. Weakening the economy of your rivals would enable you to expand your nation's franchise and monopolize the world before they did. But how do you create a business machine big enough to squeeze the likes of Britain and Portugal out of the new trade routes? To us, the answer is obvious. But in 1602, the solution was revolutionary. Several smaller, competing trade companies were forced to get along under a new name and mission. These pre-companies included businesses which had been sending ships to Asia for at least a decade. They had the experience and skills to fulfill their patriotic duties. They also had special protections. 21 years of monopoly were granted to this new consolidation in a strategic move to stem the tide of infighting. Along with this greater efficiency and profitability came resources to streamline expansions, like quasi-governmental powers. This gave the
I was about to say, there has to be some sort of benefit to the government, right? For them to allow a monopoly of this magnitude.
VOC power to negotiate treaties, wage war, establish colonies, trade posts, and even execute prisoners.
Wow.
All they needed was to secure a foothold in Asia. Then they'd solidify trade relationships, negotiate for best prices, and if need be, have proxy wars with other nations. But how do you fund a business plan this ambitious? The country needed to fend for itself against its imperialistic neighbors, but it'd be a risk to dump all their money into it, especially since seeing any profit would require a lot of time and nautical miles and pirate encounters. Someone had to be the one to come up with the first ever idea for structuring a multinational. Not an easy feat in those days when the fastest form of long-distance communication was a homing pigeon carrying parchment or a guy riding a donkey. Well, it's time to learn how history works as we charter the course of history and discover the world's first shareholders.
Like I said, very modern concept of shareholder.
This week's lesson is sponsored by Brilliant.
W ad, but we're going to skip.
It is accessible from anywhere using just a fuel whenever Brilliant.org premium. Funding for the VOC was divided between two tiers of shareholders. Of course, they didn't call them shareholders back then. Instead, they called them bevinhabers and participanten.
Participanten. Okay.
I know that sounds like a fancy brand of aspirin medication, but they were simply names for governors and ordinary investors. How much money you put in decided how much responsibility you had. It was a bold innovation which laid the groundwork for the two-tier system which we see today, like the dual-class share structures found in Google and Facebook. The governors were usually established merchants. A substantial investment bought them the right to be a part of the decision-making process, which would have been vital given their own experience with trading in boats. Their influence required access to the company's details, like bookkeeping. By comparison, ordinary investors got an ordinary return for their ordinary input. Voting rights weren't given. Company details remained mysterious, even if you could have
There's no regulations, so it's all, to the company at this point.
a sane decision-making, it would have been worthless without an insight into the company's inner workings. But that's what these people wanted. Like a limited partner in a modern investment firm, all you want is profit. You give your money to help someone else figure out all the hard stuff. On paper, this setup looks like a match made in heaven. Yet, as any modern business-minded person knows, shareholders are sometimes at odds with management. The early days of the VOC were no different. Easily, the most significant case was the Dutch entrepreneur Isaac Lemaire. Not only did his fights with the VOC lead to eventual reformations between shareholders and business owners, it even led to discoveries. As a hugely wealthy merchant, he started out as the largest shareholder in the VOC. In the end, one of his 22 children became the VOC's
A lot of children.
chief of Dejima in Japan. And yes, you heard that right. 22 kids. Guess old Isaac also wanted an investment return on his gene pool. Anyway, his fight with the VOC started soon after his own merchant trade was merged with the Dutch government's monopoly project. He expressed his concern that the company's board
Get Leo, and then you got. So this is Wolf of Wall Street.
only had company employees on it. He saw how the company's debt reduced shareholder profit. He noticed how the board was deaf to feedback. He observed how the bigwigs were becoming richer. Then he accused one of the company's ship captains of malpractice, and the company directors of manipulating share price. In retaliation, they accused him of embezzling funds and hiding receipts. Litigation ensued. Isaac lost. He was kicked out of the VOC
Of course he lost. It was set up for him to lose.
and banned from trading. However, Isaac got his own back by setting up a rival trading company outside the VOC's jurisdiction. Then, his son Jacob discovered alternative trade routes around Cape Horn. This passage was humbly named Lemaire Strait. It didn't dismantle the VOC like they had hoped, but it did remain an important maritime route until the opening of the Panama Canal. And it highlighted that the VOC wasn't as all-powerful as it thought it was. But Isaac's real legacy was in setting a precedent for shareholder rights. By becoming the first corporate activist,
That's pretty cool. That's like the first time this has ever happened in history, where the workers have some sort of voice.
Isaac's drama highlighted
I would say workers, the investors. How about that?
a need for big business structures to increase transparency and accountability. This was going to be vital when the VOC's expansion ushered in another radical business structure. Chapter 3. Charting the Chambers. After Isaac's activism efforts, discussions of autonomy and accountability spread across VOC's network. Different cities had its own chamber. Think of these like different offices of the same law firm. By breaking up different regions into chambers, it created a degree of decentralization which allowed for greater efficiency and resource management.
We see that today. Companies having different departments and head of departments, and they all are under some holistic roof. However, they operate almost autonomously to one another, but also synchronized with one another. That's also, I'm sure, I mean, that specific use case, I would say it's probably been used a long time before the VOC, but
6 chambers existed in total.
they have the Flevoland here, which is that little land space that you see in the lake. I don't think that was built until the 1900s, so this is an old map.
Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and Zeeland, which is now known as Middelburg. Each chamber had its own fleet, warehouse, personnel, and governor. Like our modern law firm example, these governors could exert influence over their specific chambers while adhering to overall policies set by the VOC's central board. Like a law firm, investors bought shares in specific chambers rather than the VOC in general.
Okay.
So returns were based on the profits of that specific chamber.
That's more risky, I guess. That's like, that's not blue chip. That's more or less like a mid-market in terms of stocks, like middle of the road. I think it's be obviously a safer bet when you invest the entire company versus a small section of it. But you have a higher reward possible because you won't get diluted from the other chambers.
The good thing about this is it incentivized shareholders to make their chambers as efficient as possible. But the downside was your chamber's level of profit could ultimately be affected by elements outside your control. Maybe your chosen chamber simply didn't have the best geography to facilitate trade, or there was a local labor shortage.
Oh, so it's also geographically influenced here? Interesting.
Maybe you had worse weather or a disease outbreak. Needless to say, not all chambers were built equal. Amsterdam was the real moneymaker. It was responsible for half of the initial capital raised. Zeeland was the second most important.
I mean, you can see the winners are the people with the best ports,
with the other fleets being further down the hierarchy. However, they could still have influence over bigger chambers. Representatives from each chamber would meet regularly as part of the Heeren 17. Here, they worked to coordinate efforts by formulating and enforcing policies in what was the 1600s version of a co-op. The exception is they prioritized profit over member welfare and distribution of power. Usually in a co-op, every shareholder has one vote, regardless of the level of investment, but the VOC chambers were influenced proportionally. In theory, an early investor in Amsterdam could use their bigger returns to leapfrog an early investor in a small chamber. But to prevent this going out of control, a new system was brought in whereby normal citizens could get a slice of the pie. Chapter 4. Harboring Wealth. Attracting a diverse investment base was vital for growth. Wealthy merchants were instrumental as early backers, but finding ways to bring in average people would transform the already innovative business into something more sustainable.
I think he's mentioned this, but I'm guessing like they'll get paid dividends in terms of, because it's very hard to track. I mean, can you imagine? I wonder how much corruption went into this, because there's no real regulation at all. There's no regulation, is there?
And progressive. Investing was open for all, and it didn't matter if you were a small trader, an artisan, or even a domestic servant. Take Neeltjen Cornelia. She was the housemaid of Dirk van O, an early investor in the VOC. For a whole month in 1602, she witnessed her employer doing dealings with the other company directors, including our friend Isaac Lemaire. Naturally, she was intrigued. It turns out Dirk Van O was raising the capital for the entire Dutch East India Company by selling its stakes to interested parties. But this once-in-a-history opportunity had a deadline. The bookkeeper had to finalize the ledger of capital raising by midnight of the final day of the month. Neeltjen thought about it for days, but she didn't know the first thing about business. But she didn't need to. As a housemaid, she knew an awful lot about people, so when she saw how other people were behaving, she knew something big was about to happen. As the clock hands neared 12, the bookkeeper heard a knock at the door. The old woman had come to invest 100 guilders into the world's first IPO. How much is 100 guilders, you ask?
$1.
Well, exchanging that amount into modern dollars is not simple. So let's just say that if her wages were 50 cents a day, then it was more than likely her life savings. The bookkeeper realized he could give his own servant a bonus with a stake in the VOC. He put her down for 50 guilders.
So it looks like she was trying to make a life, like that. She needed a golden parachute somehow.
5 minutes before midnight. So how much did the housemaid earn? Well, the VOC's initial pool of capital was 3,674,945 guilders. Neeltjen had put down 100, which means that she owned less than 0.001% of the company. But that amount of a $7.2 trillion business lands you just under $196 million. You could say this housemaid really cleaned up.
So did she get paid?
But even if she didn't have the money to put down at the final moment, she could have used another innovation. An option to pay in installments were offered to investors who couldn't buy stock.
They had a firm? If you know what a firm is, you got the joke.
Straight away. In essence, a person could pledge an investment which they paid off over time. These payment options helped attract
almost like layaway, but not necessarily layaway. It's more or less, you guys know what I mean.
A broader investor base. Company expansions were streamlined and the finances were more stable. With the emergence of a modern equity market, other ventures would soon take notice, which led to the groundwork we have today. However, this buy now, pay later model wasn't a one-size-fits-all. Forget a firmer Klarna, where you can pay over 12 months.
I just said a firm. Yeah, what about interest? That was something I was thinking about.
For those shoes that you probably can't afford. Details had to be hashed out between the bookkeepers and investors. Each installment had a payment deadline, but failing to keep up your end of the deal had possible fallouts. The first
can you imagine?
Is you lose your rights for the future shares reserved for you. Other investors deemed more reliable could snap those up so the company could make ends meet, thereby capping your lucrative investment. But the more devastating punishment was losing rights to the shares you already paid for. You'd no longer be entitled to the upside and dividends of the shares that you'd cleared. Your only choice was to beg for forgiveness, work out a new repayment plan, or watch debt collectors carry out your furniture. More than likely, you'd just have the money that you paid refunded. But that would sting, knowing a missed payment was how you lost out on generational wealth. But the social cost could be much more. Once word got round that you defaulted on a payment, your reputation would be tarnished. Merchants and other businesses would be less inclined to work with someone who couldn't keep up their end of the deal. It's not like you could just pack up and move to a city so easily, or head on down to the unemployment office to get your resume out there. That's why some of the buy now pay later investors sold their stock when they saw financial trouble ahead. The first guy to do this was Jan Allerts. He knew he was heading for a rough patch, but couldn't find a way out.
Just trying to short it.
So on the 3rd of March 1603, he became the first shareholder to sell the rights to his shares. 2,400.
Oh, like I said, there's no regulation here. How do you? So he made a market out of him. Like, he literally created his own market.
100 guilders went to Maria van Egmont, and a further 600 went to Mrs. van Berossum. The good news was the shares had risen in value since he first bought them. So though he missed out on the big bucks at the end of his investment, he was able to make a nice little profit on his sale. Active stock trading had just been invented. Of course, people sold their stocks when they had an immediate debt to pay. Like when someone on Facebook Marketplace sells a recently bought PS5 because the rent is due. However, Jan Allerts proved that trading stocks for profit wasn't a bad way to go. From then on, shares were swapped in St. Olaf's Chapel or
share arbitrage
on a bridge by the harbor, right next to market stalls selling meats and grain. Things picked up so much that a few years later, in August of 1611, Amsterdam opened the world's first stock exchange. This new building might not have been a stock exchange
It all became because of the Dutch East India Company. Interesting.
in the way we would imagine one in our time, but it opened the doors to a new way to make money
Like a courtyard for people to talk.
from investing. And a new way to make money always changes how business is done. Chapter 5. Treasuries and Treacheries. By the mid-17th century, the stock exchange had become a sophisticated fixture of every financial landscape. Other countries and cities took note of this revolutionary centralized market and
That's London.
set up their own exchanges. London and Paris followed suit, which enabled their local businesses to raise funds faster and more efficiently. Some of the early practices are still around, like buying and selling based on market fluctuations and even the establishment of a regulatory framework. Now investors could diversify their portfolio. You could even become a stock trader if you had the experience, or lack of experience. But growth like this doesn't come without issues. Tension between governors and ordinary investors never fully went away, and the monopolistic nature of the VOC meant there was a limit to the influence shareholders had on its structure and.
By the way, I will say the B-roll in this entire video is just interesting. It's just been interesting this entire time. There's just been so much B-roll, but I'm not complaining. It's interesting.
Direction. And as the competition continued with Britain's trading company, plus ongoing issues
What is this? Like a tapestry or very interesting. Like India.
with smuggling and piracy, the VOC did what every company does when it gets too big. It took on too much debt. In the end, debt was being used to finance its vast operations. Perhaps it would have had better
A debt to who? To other nations? To the government?
luck funding the extensive military and trading network if the executives at the top hadn't been more interested in lining their pockets. Instead, the multinational was plagued with mismanagement, inefficiency, and sluggishness. Its bureaucracy had once been its greatest strength, but now it was its biggest liability. The good thing about being a small company is your nimbleness allows you to react to market trends quickly. But the VOC was too big of a ship to turn around when the tides turned. Trading spices was the cornerstone of the VOC's vast wealth, but now this sector was crashing. The goods were oversupplied and other trading companies were offering better deals. Plus, consumers were losing interest. They had become more interested in the commodities that the VOC's trade routes didn't carry, like cotton and sugar. It's ironic.
The New World.
The money the VOC generated was used by investors to develop industries that led to its undoing. Textiles were becoming the next big thing. The Industrial Revolution wasn't far off. It also didn't help that France had invaded and set up a puppet government.
The Louis. This is Louis somebody. I forget which Louis this is.
After 200 years as a multinational pioneer,
I don't think that was the Sun King.
the Dutch East India Company was turning hollow. The doors were officially closed in 1799, 3 years after the Dutch company stepped in to stabilize the situation. Once it was dissolved, the remaining assets were nationalized, including its debt and colonial administration. Perhaps executives blamed external factors, like the Dutch-Anglo Wars. These encounters did cripple the VOC's naval power and trade routes, and the new political
Dutch-Anglo War, so like with England?
allegiances formed through the century did encourage trade through other means. But really, the VOC's downfall was caused by the thing that created its rise: investors. Everyday consumers decide where to spend their cash. If they don't want to give it to you, they'll give it to your competitor. That means that shareholders and customers
So they created a market which ultimately lifted them out.
were in charge all along. They just didn't know it. Or did they? Do
Wow, what a video, guys. So we learned a little bit more about the Dutch East India Company. Pretty much, it created a stock market, the stock exchange. It pretty much was the beginning of how people interpret investing, interpret stocks and shareholders, and utilizing rights and voting to a company that is a corporation without any regulations at all. No government interference, but also pretty much relying on IOUs and just loyalty and credibility. Very interesting system. Wonder, credit had not been invented yet, had it? I'm sure it had at this time, but it's just not intertwined within the zeitgeist of government affairs, I guess. But nevertheless, If you made it this far, I appreciate you so much. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if you like these types of videos, hit that subscribe button. If you got a recommendation for a certain type of video that you watched and you want me to react to, please send it my way via the comment section, or recommend a video that you think would be great to learn with you guys. But yeah, guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.